Thank you so much for coming to the presentation. This is the first time I've presented on my PhD research, so it's a work in progress, and I would really appreciate feedback and questions and as much interaction as possible, really. And I should say, actually, well, the title of my presentation is Revisiting Young Lives Data with a Narrative Lens. What insights does a narrative analytic approach offer to children's talk about everyday life and growing up in Andhra Pradesh, India? I realised after I came up with that title that it's slightly misleading in the sense that what I've done with the Young Lives data is not revisiting it, because I'm actually looking at it for the first time, but it is a revisiting in the sense that the data was generated and has been analysed already by other researchers, and I'm coming to it to do secondary analysis. What I may end up doing at a future stage in my PhD research is revisiting the data myself, but that's something I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so in terms of the structure of the presentation, I'm going to start by talking a bit about my PhD research and the rationale for this. I'll then move on to talk specifically about the secondary analysis of a very small section of Young Lives qualitative data, which is part of my PhD research. I'll give the theoretical basis for analysing data in the way that I've done, and then present some contextual themes from the data and some extracts which I think contain narratives which open up these themes and children's understandings and how they make sense of these things. And at that stage, I'm going to actually hand out some extracts of data with some analysis around them, and I'd really appreciate people's insights into those. And then I'll end by reflecting on this phase of work. So in terms of my PhD research, I started my PhD last October, and I'm based here at the Thomas Coram Research Unit. And my PhD is linked to a research node called Novella, which a number of people have already mentioned, but I'll just explain. It stands for Narratives of Varied Everyday Lives and Linked Approaches. There's 3 projects which make up Novella, and my PhD research is very closely linked to a project called Family Lives and the Environment, which is one of those 3 projects. And I've been working very closely with the Family Lives and Environment team, and particularly closely with Natasha, who's already introduced herself, and with Emma on this phase of the research. The title of my PhD research specifically is Children's Everyday Experiences, Understandings and Practices of the Environment in 2 Countries. The age group that I'm interested in for this research is age 11 to 12. And really, my research has to do with comparing children's lives in their everyday complexity with the ways in which children's lives are conceptualised in environmental literature. So children as an abstract social group are often invoked to give impetus to the moral arguments for pro-environmental action, whether that be around climate change, sustainability, or reducing environmental vulnerability. My research aims to get beyond the rhetoric of children as future citizens of the planet, or as a particularly vulnerable group in need of protection, to look at the things that matter to children in their everyday lives and imagined futures, and the different identities they take on in the things they do and the places they go. So I'm interested in children as sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, grandchildren, students, travellers, consumers, TV watchers, fencers, skateboarders and woodcrafters, and those last 3 examples come from children we've piloted with in the UK in the last few weeks. Children take on multiple identities in their lives, and amidst all of these, I'm interested in finding where, if at all, environmental concerns may feature in these everyday lives. And I'm using a narrative research methodology to try and get at children's multiple identities in order to explore this question. Given that climate change is a global phenomenon which will affect different communities in different ways, and which will be communicated to different communities in different ways, I'm interested in looking at the difference it makes to be living in a rural or an urban area, to be part of an affluent middle class or poor family, and to be living in the global north or the global south, and what difference this makes to children's understandings of the natural environment and how it plays a role in their daily lives and imagined futures. However, I'm not aiming to make comparisons between children in the UK and India, or between boys and girls, or rich and poor families, or between rural and urban children. It's more that I'm aiming to explore the complexities of children's everyday life through multiple perspectives. The real comparison is between abstracted conceptualizations of children and children's everyday lives. So tonight it's not the time to be talking about my PhD fieldwork, but as Corinne has already said, I will shortly be leaving for that, and I'm going to be researching with children in both rural and urban communities in Andhra Pradesh and later on in the UK. But for tonight I'm going to be talking about the secondary analysis I've been doing on a very small amount of Young Lives data. And that's been a very important process in terms of preparing for the fieldwork, but it's also been a very valuable phase of research in its own right. Okay, so just a little bit about Young Lives to people who don't already know it. Young Lives is a longitudinal research study investigating the changing nature of childhood poverty in 4 countries, Ethiopia, India, Peru and Vietnam, over the period of 2001 to 2016. It's co-funded by the UK Department for International Development, and in the UK it's hosted at Oxford University. The research is both quantitative and qualitative in nature and involves collecting survey data from 12,000 poor children living in rural and urban communities across these 4 countries. It also involves a subsample of 200 children from the same countries, from the same sample indeed, and their caregivers. At every phase of work, there's 2 cohorts of children under study. One, the younger cohort who were born in 2001, and the older cohort who were born in 1994. Young Lives is a fascinating study with great potential to speak to the poverty reduction policy agenda with empirically based research. And I'd love to talk more about it, but I'm going to have to limit myself to that. But I would say that for familiarization with the study as a whole, this book, which recently came out called Childhood Poverty, Multidisciplinary Approaches, edited by Jay Boyden and Michael Bourdion, is a really good introduction to the study and includes some of the research findings from the earlier rounds of research. So, specifically talking about the qualitative data that I was looking at in my secondary analysis, these data were collected with the aim of getting children's perspectives on 2 broad themes. And those are resources, choices and transitions, and risk protective processes and well-being. And at every round of data collection, and there's been 3, and I think the 4th is actually taking place very shortly, at every round of data collection there's been a number of methods used to generate data. So always individual interviews with children and caregivers, always participatory group exercises with children, although these varied in content from round to round, and focus group interviews with caregivers and community stakeholders, and also community level reports which were drawn up by the researchers and based on their observations. So these were all the data collected for the qualitative subsample. I've been looking at data collected with the older cohort of children, and they were aged 12, 13 and 15 at the 3 rounds I've been looking at. And I had access to these data through my involvement with the Family Lives and Environment Project, of which Young Lives is a partner. Sorry, that's kind of obscured there. Okay, so before I move on to talk about how I selected cases and talk about the cases themselves, I'm just going to present the aims I had for this phase of my research, because I think this informs the cases I ended up looking at and the ways that I analysed these. So my aims were to increase my contextual understanding of children's lives in rural and urban Andhra Pradesh, to explore the extent to which secondary narrative analysis can be carried out on data that was not collected with a narrative methodology and which has been translated from the original language, to develop a narrative analytic framework with which to analyse data collected for the later phase of primary research I'm going to go on to do in both countries. To identify examples or absences of environmental discourses in children's talk about environmental events and practices, in order to draw upon these again later on in my primary research. And finally, to work in collaboration with the Family Lives and Environment Project to both inform and learn from their expertise and to benefit from and contribute to the Novella Node as a whole. Which are all quite ambitious aims to have. And now my research questions, which are quite linked into that. So my research questions were: how do narratives emerging from interviews and activities with children and other family members speak to theories of how environment features in children's interactions with objects, individuals, and nature itself in the different spaces they inhabit? What connections, if any, do children make between environmental conditions, understandings, and practices, both in their narratives of everyday consumptive practices and of disruptions such as crop failure, extreme weather events, and unplanned urban development? And finally, how does living in a rural or urban setting impact upon the ways in which children understand the relationship between their lives and the natural environment? And these are broadly the questions I'll also be taking to my own data collection, although I will be narrowing and refining these throughout the data collection and analysis process. Okay, so I've called this the magnifying glass focus in terms of how I've selected my cases. There's 3,000 children being researched as part of this project in Andhra Pradesh, and I've ended up looking in depth at 4. So that's why it's the narrative, the magnifying glass focus. To a certain extent, the cases I ended up looking at were determined by the research design. We wanted to look at the qualitative data from Andhra Pradesh. We wanted to look at the older cohort because that more closely matched the age group of the children we'd be researching with. And so the real question was how we were going to select cases within the 24 older cohort cases in this qualitative subsample. And when it came to that phase, Natasha and I took our research interests and our aim to do secondary narrative analysis to these 24 cases. And we read through all 24 transcripts from the later round of data collection for these 24 children. And we selected our 8 cases for potential secondary narrative analysis in line with our research questions and the narrative approach that we wanted to take to the data. Of the 8 cases selected, Natasha and colleagues on the Family Lives and the Environment Project have been carrying out an analysis on all 8. I've used the 8 cases for contextualisation, but within those 8 cases I selected 4 for in-depth narrative analysis. And I chose to analyse data from 2 children living in Hyderabad and from 2 children living in a coastal community, as this more closely matched the geographical areas that I'm going to be looking at in the primary research. And of those 4 cases, the 2 I'm going to be talking about tonight are the 2 urban cases, and it's a boy and a girl. So before I present those cases, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my engagement with narrative literature. I should say at the start of this section that I didn't necessarily come onto this PhD project with the principal aim of carrying out narrative research, or even with any more of an interest in methodology than the average prospective PhD student. My interests in the PhD were more immediately linked to the substantive questions around children and environment, which are part of the Family Lives and Environment Project. However, working as part of the Novella Node, I've had access to workshops and seminars on narrative, and the opportunity to work as part of a team that includes people with a great deal of specialism in narrative. And so my involvement with novella so far has helped me to own the narrative methodology of novella for myself and for my PhD. And what I'm about to say here could be seen as my own narrative of my engagement with the methodological narrative literature. So, One of the first things that interested me when I started reading up on narrative was reading researchers' accounts of using how researchers' accounts of using narrative research talked about the active role of stories in human interactions. So I like this quote from Mark Freeman. He talks about narratives as sense-making tools that inevitably do things for people, for social institutions, for culture, and more. And Jerome Bruner, he famously writes as humans as homo neurans, exercising humanity through the way in which they tell narratives. And Corinne Squire has also written about this in the way she sums up experience-centered narrative approach as that which assumes the sequential temporal orderings of human experience into narratives are not just characteristic of humans, but make us human. So the idea of storytelling as an active exercise in human interactions led me to thinking about the immediate research context in which stories are told and how the relationship between speakers and space in the interview context may impact upon what the speaker understands to be meaningful or permissible to share. And Anne Phoenix, who's one of my PhD students, has, among others, written about the interview space as a space for the co-construction of narratives. And this came to life for me in reading through the Young Lives data as I came across different voices taken on by both the child and the researcher at points of agreement and disagreement within the speakers in the same interview space. As I became attentive to this, the cautions I'd read in literature on researching with children against searching for a child's authentic voice started to make sense to me in a practical as well as a theoretical way. As I saw that, as Paul Connolly has written, it's meaningless to attempt to identify which voice represents the child's true and authentic voice. In a sense, they are all equally authentic. And both Paul Connolly and Wendy Luttrell, in her work on children's visual voices, make connections between the voices taken on by children and the discursive power relations at play in that interview context, and talk about how the children use their awareness of these dynamics, not always, but sometimes, to challenge and at times upturn the dominant relationship between adult and child, researcher and participant. So this was again an example to me of how talk in the interview context was not just the communication of details, but was actively doing something for the speaker. And finally, for the sake of this very brief narrative around how theoretical literature opened up the data I went to analyse, I became aware of the importance given to time and temporality in narrative research. And Franzesi writes that narratives are characterised by both a referential function, which is the way that speakers structure the telling of events, and an evaluative function, which are points where the speakers step out of the telling of the story to evaluate their responses to these events. And this made me think about how a story does not remain static, but is brought into the present through the way it's retold. And all of this is summed up very nicely by Catherine Reisman, who writes about narratives in everyday speech, saying that in everyday oral storytelling, a speaker connects events into a sequence that is consequential for later action and for the meanings that the speaker wants listeners to take away from the story. Events perceived by the speaker as important are selected, organised, connected, and evaluated as meaningful for a particular audience. And the reminder in there that oral storytelling is an everyday process also served as a reminder to me to focus on the everyday narratives within the Young Lives data, and not just look for the big narratives around environmental disruptions or power structures or any of the things which I was interested in when I was going towards the data. Okay. So now I'm going to get on to talking about the two cases that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And they are, it's two children called Ramatula and Sanya, who live in Hyderabad, which is the state capital of Andhra Pradesh. You can just see it on the map there. They live in a Muslim part of the city. It's called a slum by the researchers in their research report. And they describe it as a congested and chaotic area with narrow lanes and stagnant water. litter on the roads, closed windows and doors, and women moving around in burqas. And a conversation with the lead qualitative researcher for Young Lives in Andhra Pradesh confirmed this description by describing it as a very private place, low on levels of trust and social cohesion, where family members, especially women, spend time indoors and share little with their neighbours. And the area is connected to the main city by road, and therefore within easy reach of all the amenities that Hyderabad, as a growing economic power, has to offer. It's very much separate from this world. And I'm actually going to visit this community when I go out to India in a couple of weeks' time. What I'm saying here is other people's tellings of this place. But I found that the group data was actually really useful in terms of contextualising the individual data that was collected as part of Young Lives qualitative research. And particularly children's talk about their area within this group data. And so it was this group data itself which led me to come up with two kind of sets of themes which I could take to the individual narratives I was going to look at. And these are, sorry, one of them is slightly obscured there, but danger, lack of trust, and hierarchies of power, and the gendered use of space and mobility. And I'm now just going to read out some extracts from the group data which opened up these, or which illustrate these themes. So this first one, danger, lack of trust, and hierarchies of power. This is from the Round 1 Boys group activity in 2007, so the first round of data collection. And this is the facilitator's own telling of what happened within that group activity. Group members also added that there is a haunted house, a very big one, at the entrance of the community. According to them, there is a ghost in that big house. Nobody dares to enter that house. Only sometimes big people in cars go inside and come out. The facilitator asked them whether they felt frightened, and they said yes, but they do not share their fear with their parents because they in turn will scold them. And the second quote's from a year later. Next, the facilitator asked the boys to explain the topic of illness due to stagnant water and mosquitoes. Ramatula and another child said that due to stagnant water from heavy rains there is an increase in mosquitoes, and due to this the people of this locality suffered a lot with chicken guinea and dengue fever. All this is due to the uncleanliness of the surroundings. At present, new cement roads have been developed because of the upcoming elections. The government is working effectively due to the elections. The people need votes to win in the elections, so they are working. They come to the houses and make promises that they do this, and this and that after the elections, but they will not see this through. So again, this is the facilitator's rendering of what the children said in these contexts. And these extracts were interesting to me in that they demonstrated the children's growing awareness of the dangers and the hierarchies of power in that particular community. And it's tempting to argue that the progression that you see between those 2 years, from the first extract, which seems like quite a childish interpretation of events, to the second one, which seems to be kind of a collective demonstration of political astuteness. It's tempting to argue that that's because it's a year later and they're so much more grown up. But 1 year is not really very long. And furthermore, at different points within the same interview round and within the same activity even, you see the boys presenting themselves in different ways as responsible or childish or shy or authoritative. And that's taking place within the same context. So I think that the contrasts here speak more to the earlier point that I mentioned by Connolly on the fruitlessness of the search for the child's authentic voice, or collective authentic voice in this case. Okay, I'm now just going to read out some quotes which relate to the second theme, which is the gendered use of space and mobility. And this is the boys', again, collective perspective, and again, the facilitator's rendering of this. So she writes, 2 boys said that the boys teased the girls by going fast on their bikes, setting the songs on mobile phones loudly and increasing the speed so that noisy sound comes out, then beating the girls on the backside as they go past. One of the participants referred to an incident which happened nearby where a college guy was driving fast and struck a young girl who died. There are no speed brakes on the road to slow people down, so this is happening. Boys also, to draw attention, make circles on their bikes. This is shown on television, and the boys see this from an early age and want to imitate it. So that's from the boys group activity in 2008. And then this quote is from a girl's perspective, and it was gathered in the context of a community mapping exercise. And Sanya, who's the case child who I'm going to go on to talk about, is talking about how she uses space within the local community. And again, this is the facilitator writing what Sanya says. Sanya shared about the petty shop in their community where all foods, from chocolates to rice, are available. She drew stick diagrams of humans in the corner of the lane in the community and explained that Gandubashe, which means dirty or wicked boys, stay here, who constantly persecute the girls in the community who wear a burqa. When the facilitator questioned whether at any time she had had an opportunity to report this to her older brothers or family members, Sanya shared that her family members had warned the boys many times, but they still continued to do the same thing. And slightly later on in the same activity, she said that she likes the playground in the school very much, where she gets an open environment to play. She likes playing bat and ball, skipping, and playing hide and seek in the playground, and says Bahut Maza Atahai, which means she enjoys playing them. However, she doesn't get much time to play at home, or rather she is not allowed to play at home. She shared that she can personally identify a difference between when she was young and she was allowed to play outside and the time since she is biologically grown up, as now her mother and the family restrict her from playing outside. If there are no boys in the vicinity of the community, then her mother allows her to play outside. So conversations with the lead qualitative researcher for Andhra Pradesh have confirmed that in this particular community, as girls' use of outdoor space is restricted, boys' use of space becomes more far-reaching, as boys are increasingly called upon to carry out responsible tasks within the family context which involve going further afield, such as accompanying a younger sister to school or going out to a further away market to get provisions. So this is seen in both Sanya and Ramatila's narratives across time in the different interview rounds. Sanya's space gradually gets smaller and Ramatila's space opens up in tandem with the growing responsibilities he has. In my analysis, as I turned from these group reports to the individual interview transcripts to look for narratives of everyday life, with an attention to all these tensions that are presented around space and gender and danger and hierarchies of power, I began to see how Ramatila and Sanya spoke of their uses of different objects and spaces in different ways in constructing themselves as responsible children within these gender-bounded categories of what it means to be a responsible child in that place. And this has opened up a gendered aspect to understandings of the everyday lives and the natural environment, which I hadn't necessarily anticipated, but I may need to incorporate into my primary research. It may just be that it's this particular community, though, and I think there is quite a lot to be said for the kind of danger involved in this particular community. And it's not just a case that girls are called to stay at home. I was rereading the data for Ramatila, and there's a lot around danger and him being called to stay at home as well. So I don't want to overemphasise that gender difference, but there are some very clear distinctions, I think, through reading through this. I'm going to, in just a second, ask you to look at some extracts from data. But before I do so, I just wanted to comment on something which I think is really interesting, which is the voice of the facilitator which comes through this data. In this extract, it's particularly obvious because it's in parenthesis and some aspects haven't necessarily been translated, and so it's very obvious. But this, just looking at this extract, makes me think of the many voices that come across. You've got Sanya telling her stories of everyday life. Then you've got the facilitator writing it up. Then you've got the translator writing this account. And then I myself have explained this in another way. And it's been one of the really interesting aspects of doing this work is just considering how many voices come across in the final analysis of data. So that's a bit of a side point, but quite an interesting one. Okay. So I've now got some extracts from data to look through, and just before I do so, just explaining why I've chosen these particular extracts. One of the ways in which Sanya, Ramatila and their family members talk about their use of space is through the meanings they give to different objects which permit or restrict mobility. And so I've chosen some extracts around different objects. So for Ramatila it's a bicycle, and for Sanya it's a television. And as we look at these, just wanted to think about how the narratives, which are quite mundane, everyday narratives, evoked around these objects, speak to these wider themes that I've been presenting here around danger, indoor and outdoor space, gendered mobilities, and hierarchies of power. So I'm going to give out these extracts and then really welcome, it's not just extracts of data, it's also got some, I've introduced them, but it's analysis around the extracts really. So I'd welcome feedback on the data themselves, but also on the way that I've framed them. And just a couple of points to make. As I've said, this is translated data, and so I've kind of tidied it up slightly, but it was very tempting, I found, when I was looking at this data, to really pay attention to specific words and specific phrasings of things, but that's not actually that helpful in a sense, because it's just the way it's been translated. And secondly, although the data have been anonymised, I still prefer it if you don't take them away, so I will be collecting these up at the end. So I've got two sets of extracts, one for Ramatila and one for Sanya. So I'll start. So, just coming back to the question that's embedded in the title of this seminar, what insights does a narrative analytic approach offer to children's talk about everyday life and growing up in Andhra Pradesh? I've found that looking at the narratives told by Sanya, Ramatila, their peers and their family members have enabled me to get beyond the big stories in the data, which immediately jumped out to me, which are the kinds of things that I talked about at the start, kind of danger, corruption, instability, gendered use of space. And looking at the data through a narrative lens has led me to some of the more mundane and arcane meanings that individuals construct in their everyday lives around objects, events, and relationships. And looking for the small everyday narratives has certainly brought my attention to details in the data that I wouldn't have seen without a conscious attention to where stories were being told, how they were structured, and how individuals were evaluating the meanings of objects, events, and relationships. So it's definitely brought a new take on the data to me, which I wouldn't have seen before. And bear in mind, this is the first time I've done a narrative analysis, so I wouldn't have been looking out for these things necessarily. And also, carrying out this analysis has given me the contextual understanding, which will enable me to refine my research questions and focus for the primary analysis. And methodologically, this phase of research has enabled me to construct and tentatively apply a narrative framework to analysing these data, as well as giving me insight into the practicalities of carrying out narrative analysis and the amount of time it takes to do it well and meaningfully. For this reason, I think that if data are available for the research context where a proposed piece of research is going to take place, carrying out a secondary analysis of data can be a very useful tool for researchers in terms of both contextualising a research setting and bringing methodological literature to life. I've certainly found both in my research. The secondary analysis should not necessarily take place instead of a literature review, but I think can be quite helpful to do alongside a literature review. In my research, I found it quite difficult to balance my time between these two endeavours, but I think if a researcher is able to see them as complementary rather than competing endeavours, they could work well in parallel. And this can be particularly useful in a context where, as was the case for me, the researcher has no previous experience of carrying out research in that setting. In hindsight, I think I would do a thematic analysis of the whole data set, or in this case the 8 cases, before selecting individual cases for narrative analysis. I think that it would help to refine the research questions I was taking to those particular cases. And so this is something I'm planning to do with my own data when I get this in the research I do. I may also revisit the Young Lives data, genuine revisiting this time for me. I'm not sure I'm definitely going to have time to do this, but I think it would be interesting to come back to these data at a later stage and look at how it was different doing a secondary narrative analysis on data when I've spent time in that particular context. Finally, before I finish, I just want to share a few words about working collaboratively, and then I'd welcome feedback and questions. So working collaboratively on this analysis with Natasha and with Emma and with other members of the Family Lives and Environment research team has been really useful in terms of drawing my attention to alternative interpretations of accounts. And also, this setting here has also been really useful for that. But it's also drawn my attention to the fact that you can never truly know the intended meaning of the speaker. And the impossibility of knowing is, in this case, partly a product of the distance between ourselves and the data, so cultural distance, linguistic difference, never having spent time in that particular context. However, as Corinne has written in her chapter on experience-centred narrative research, even where researchers do have familiarity with speakers and context, there's no certainty that one single interpretation will emerge, and in fact, that probably shouldn't happen. And whilst acknowledging this is the case, Corinne's chapter has a number of methods for building a persuasive case for a particular analysis, such as checking interpretations against the original data, actively seeking out contrary cases, submitting analyses to external assessment, and getting feedback from participants. This latter point is not something I can do with this particular phase of my research, but I think what's been really useful has been working in a collaborative research team which includes includes people who work for Young Lives, but specifically Uma, who actually carried out some of the interviews herself and has an incredibly good knowledge of the intricacies of family life in these contexts. It's been really, really invaluable to be able to talk about these data with her. And so whilst it's not a substitute for having actually been there in the research context, the insights of the original researchers will, by the end of this phase of my research, have been invaluable in constructing my final analyses. And so I think that working collaboratively on this kind of project has been really useful. I've got some references there. I think this is going to go up online, and hopefully Rowena can send the link round to everyone who attended, so you can go back and look at these references. And now, just if there's any further questions or any further feedback, like I said, I'm at quite an early stage in my PhD research, and so feedback is particularly useful. But that's it, basically.